Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to this session. I'm going to talk to you about something that is really, really interesting, has lots of substance and content in it, and I'm going to do it because you're quite smart people. I'm going to do this quite fast in order to leave time at the end for questions. So put your phones away, don't do your email, listen to me as I take you through a whole new world of cybersecurity threats and challenges. This photograph is one of the very rare pictures taken on Boxing Day 2004 of the terrible tsunami that swept onto the beaches around the Pacific and Indian Oceans. You can see the people there had until recently been playing on the beach and have just realized that something that is going to sweep them away is coming towards them. About two-thirds, in a recent survey that we conducted of senior security people, about two-thirds of US respondents believed that deepfakes would have a tremendous impact upon their organizations. About two-thirds believed that it hadn't really happened yet, and about two-thirds reckon that their organizations weren't doing enough to combat the threat. So a lot of organizations in which you and your contacts are engaged with are a little bit like people suddenly realizing what's about to happen to them on the beach. And it's not just theoretical. We were hearing in the keynotes this morning about KnowBe4, who owned up to hiring a North American hacker remotely into their workforce, and they only found out about him when he started to install malware onto his business laptop to try to engage in an intrusion. John Holmquist said that many of the Fortune 500 companies now have remote imposters working their way through their remote HR recruitment processes. So this is happening now. Another clear example is Arup Consulting, a worldwide civil engineering consultancy, very, very cyber aware, who recently lost $25 million when their Hong Kong-based CFO was asked to set up a series of major new payments. Being a smart person, he immediately queried this. He demanded a video call with his CEO, which went well, but he still wasn't convinced, so he demanded a video conference with his regional board. The regional board, who I believe he knew of, authorized him. He made the payment. Every single person on that regional board video conference had been deepfaked. And they at least have owned up to it. Who knows how many other people have already been caught. Let's talk about biometrics for a second. And I'll bring these two threads together. Why are biometrics important? Well, in all sorts of aspects to do with access and control and rights and so on, you're dealing with people's biographics, you're dealing with facts about people, but trust does not reside in facts. Trust resides in people. It's between people's ears that good things and bad things happen. So at some point, you have to bind the facts about a person to that physical person themselves. And typically, that is done using a face, because photo ID is the #1 way of binding a set of biographic facts to someone, to a human being. So face biometrics are, in some cases, absolutely obligatory. You can't get around it. So when you are remotely onboarding a member of the public, when you're setting up an account, when you're setting up a super user with privileged access to your internal systems, when you're creating a digital identity for access to who are able to file their accounts or their tax returns online, you can't get to the task of binding that physical individual to the image, to the trusted image on the photo ID. I mean, you can get around it, you're just creating a colossal risk. And as we've just seen in video conferencing, where trust is so implicit that you believe, because you believe the evidence of your eyes, that you're talking to the person who you think you're talking to, you have to, at a certain point, confirm that and check that. But there are other occasions when we want to be sure that a person is whom they claim to be, and today, a lot of that resides in trust in the device. If you've got control of your own device, with stored credentials, stored passwords, stored certificates, stored biometrics, then everything must be all right. Well, sometimes it's all right and sometimes it isn't. This is a street in Britain, and there is a youngster on his bicycle, and suddenly the businessman doesn't have his phone anymore. At that precise moment, he lost control of his life. This actually happened to me in the streets of London, only the cyclist was a bit incompetent, so he dropped the phone and lost it. So at that point, at that point, you have a major problem. So we've said that faces must secure aspects of a life cycle. Faces can secure the entire identity life cycle, and we're starting to see areas in which enterprises are now start choosing to use biometrics, and that's typically face biometrics, for a broader range of applications. So after that phone got stolen, this poor man had to get his account back, and he had to do that in the absence of his device, because it wasn't there anymore. And this whole recovery process has to be done on the basis of secure credentials which aren't reliant on possession, and face biometrics are the only way of doing that. We're coming across a wider and wider range of use cases where the employee, for example, is not allowed to carry their personal device in clean rooms, in food hygiene areas, in pharmaceuticals, in trading rooms and call centers, places where it is forbidden to bring a personal device of any sort. We're seeing regulators beginning to realize that multi-factor authentication means multi-factor, so that if you have a factor based upon a device, the other factor has to be independent, truly independent of the device, and device-based biometrics do not meet that requirement, so cloud-based biometrics are essential in order to provide true two-factor authentication. There is a growing trend now also to bring together a face-powered digital identity together with physical access, and you're starting to see that both in buildings and also on the border. Global entry, for example, and some of what TS is doing is to be face-powered rather than physical document-powered. So faces must and then sometimes can secure the entire life cycle. So what's the problem? Well, if biometrics are being used in this way, they are a source of trust. And there are three elements to ensuring trust in a face. One is, does it deal with the imposter threat? Is this the right person? That is the easiest attack to mount. You're the right person to get in, but it's also by far the easiest attack to deal with. 10 years ago, face matching was a really difficult and quite sexy technical topic. History, legacy. Face matching technology is now so good that we don't even need to talk about it. The impersonation problem, the one that occupies still so much discussion, is nearly irrelevant in the context of this conversation. People often say, you know, what happens if my face is stolen? I have news. You can't steal a person's face, at least not without a scalpel and a major surgical operation. But faces are neither are faces private. They are public credentials, and therefore the principal threat to them is copying. Is the presence of copying. Is the presence of copies. So the next threat that must be mitigated is the so-called presentation attack. Presentation attack is where you make a physical copy of a person's face, and that can be a photograph, it can be an image on a high-resolution screen, it can be a deepfake image on a high-resolution screen, put in front of a camera, or it can be a mask like this death mask thing here that my wife absolutely refuses to allow in the house. Any kind of physical presentation that is put in front of a camera, which looks exactly like the person, it'll pass the face matcher every time because but it's a physical artifact. Liveness, as it's is really important. Again, this has been a real topic over the last 5 years, but again, it's largely a solved problem. Again, it's largely legacy because the threat comes from somewhere else. The real threat comes from the digital injection of synthetic imagery. That is, no camera was ever involved in the process, that the data feed has been compromised, and there are a wide variety of ways, and we'll talk about them in a second, such that almost pixel-perfect image of a copy of the person's face is directly injected, just as we heard was done to KnowBe4, just as we've heard was done with Arup. There were no photographs, there were no masks. This was deepfake imagery directly injected. Let me talk to you about now, this is all kind of good theoretical stuff, but what is actually happening? Well, iProve is unique in having global visibility of what is actually happening in the threat environment to biometrics. And I just want to take you through 4 pieces of intelligence that we have seen and measured and can talk about. The first is the use of face swapping technology as an attack vector in biometrics. It is absolutely fantastic because we just put together a platform. and you can change the face on a threat actor to anyone that you like. What has really changed in the last 12 months is that before, Snapchat quality, it was quite amusing, but if you look carefully, you could spot the artifacts. I'm sorry, those days are over. Skilled analysts now cannot tell the difference between a face swap video and the real person. And that is a huge change. There's also been a tremendous expansion in the availability of tools to do this, which means that you don't need just to be a national state actor to be able to do this. There are over 100 tools out on the dark web, on the light and dark web, that enable you to do this very effectively. As a result of this, between the first and the second half of 2023, we saw an increase in the number of face swap-based injection attacks of 700%. And that trend has continued through 2024. So this kind of attack has completely displaced the use of masks or photographs or screens as an attack mechanism for biometric-based trust systems. How are they happening? Well, previously, these things used normally to be done through web browsers on laptops. Those had the most vulnerabilities to injection, and therefore a good deal of effort went into trying to detect and block it. That has changed dramatically. We saw last year a growth, almost a tripling in the volume of attacks on mobile platforms through injection. And in particular, we saw almost a quintupling in the use of emulators. Emulators are particularly toxic in this environment because a lot of these systems try to detect injection attacks by detecting that the camera source has been switched. But in an emulator, there is no switch in the camera source because the entire environment is fictitious. And in particular, Apple, which used to provide a very secure environment, has made available emulator capabilities which really, really facilitate this kind of attack. And we've seen again this kind of growth, these kind of attacks grow in proportion and in numbers explosively in 2024. Another dramatic in place is that the persistence of the threat actors has changed. In the old days, for a variety of reasons, threat actors would kind of have a go. They'd spend a week or 2 weeks, maybe even 3 weeks attacking a system. Now this goes on for 2 months, and they go on and on and on. And sometimes they go away, figure out some new tools, and come back after 6 months. The level of investment, the intensity with which actors are seeking to break into the system has been transformed in the last 12 months. This is no longer hobbyism. This is serious concerted attack with a level of resource that is consistent with investees in crime as a service, serious organized crime, and national state actors. And finally, what we've seen is a trend towards what I would describe as open source crime, that they have the number of threat groups who are engaged in discussion and joint development of attack tools against biometric and face-based systems has exploded. During 2023, we saw the number of groups involved double, and the number of members of each group was typically over 1,000 people. That gives you a sense for the level of resources that are now being applied to hacking and successfully spoofing biometric systems out in the wild. So everything that people thought they knew about biometrics until 2023 is all obsolete. We're in the reality of a new world. Now, how can we defend against these sorts of attacks, and how can we get intelligence about what's going on? You may say, where on earth did all this knowledge come from? There are 2 key elements, both of which are essential. One is that we believe that the default deepfake will shortly be undetectable. That is, the question I am asked all the time is, well, will we be able to detect deepfakes? Well, you can detect some deepfakes today. By tomorrow afternoon, you won't be able to detect the standard deepfake. The holy grail of saying, well, we've got a deepfake detector is again a transient phase. So what you have to do is you have to challenge the scene unpredictably. You have to set the attackers an unusual problem, a problem that they don't have the data to solve, And the only way you can do that is to involve a physics-based problem. You actually have to change the scene itself, not just the data stream. And that creates an unpredictably difficult problem for the attackers to meet, which introduces signals which can then be detected. In order to detect them, you have to be observing them. You have to have a biometric SOC. All of you are familiar with a security operation in the cyber arena. What we're saying here is that you have to have a security operation in the biometric arena, looking for artifacts and patterns of irregularity in the imagery itself. So if you create a problem for the attacker, which is strange enough that they emit tiny signals which provide a ground truth, and then you have the systems to actually watch what they're doing, study and learn from it, then you have some chance both of understanding and learning about the threat environment and combating it. This sounds fairly theoretical. I have to tell you that this is now working. This is what our solution to this looks like. We use the screen of the user to illuminate their face with a rapidly changing sequence of colors. Each time the color sequence is different. Each time the colors from the screen interact differently with the user's face. We stream video of their face back to our servers while it's happening, and there we analyze the reflections of that light from their face. If it reflects with the ambient illumination in an appropriate way, then we know that we're looking at a skin-covered, live, human face-shaped 3D object. And if the sequence of colors and their transitions are correct, then we know that we're looking at a genuinely contemporaneously created video and not something that has been lovingly sculpted beforehand. So we've created this very strange problem of reflected light, which we have about 1 billion data points more than the attackers to analyze. And that signals of imperfection. What we then do is the information from all of our instances worldwide. And for data sovereignty reasons, we have to have server instances in many, many parts of the world. We don't allow any dark corners to develop, so we bring all the information together so that we can study and look for those signals of imperfection and the consistency between those signals wherever they occur. We detect, using the tiny signals of imperfection which the attackers have unwittingly created, to detect and study their attacks. We analyze and replicate what they're doing, and then we, in real time, learn, adapt, and respond, ensuring that our systems are not a static target, but a moving target, and we can also provide threat intelligence to our partners. The point what that tells you is that much of the contemporary wisdom that face biometrics can be supplied as a piece of hardware or as a disk. Yes, I'm old enough to remember when software was delivered on disks. In fact, I'm old enough to remember when software was provided on floppies. The idea that face biometrics can be delivered as hardware, the disk of software, obsolete. That the only way in which face biometrics can reach the levels of cyber quality and resilience that all the rest of the enterprise requires is as a service, because it has to be continuously aware and adapting to a continuously changing threat environment. Now, that creates quite a number of challenges, because how on earth do you assess the quality and performance of the various solutions? Highly competitive market filled with a number of vendors, including, but certainly not limited to ourselves, all of whom make various claims and so on. And in an environment which is continually adapting and changing, how on earth do you assess it? And this is actually a real problem in the market at the moment. The most popular method is to believe the vendor's own claims. Well, that went well, didn't it? So then, what about standardized tests and certifications? Well, bizarrely enough, there have not been any serious standardized tests and certifications in the biometric authentication market. There have been standards for how you would conduct tests, but there was no consensus on exactly how they should be conducted and what quality levels should be done until this year. In May of this year, the FIDO Alliance published and announced its standard for cloud-based biometric assurance for identity verification and onboarding. It announced a series of certified laboratories, and it outlined in some detail the tests that should be undertaken and the quality standards that should be met. And they required vendors who went through this test sequence to publish their results, which is relatively unusual because it's so much nicer to go, yeah, passed, we passed by the skin of our teeth or by a country mile. So the FIDO standard represents a milestone for this industry. To some extent, it is a partial milestone because today it only addresses presentation attacks. You'll remember my earlier screen in which I showed mask, the physical artifact attack. That's what the FIDO addresses. Because today the issue of how do you determine the resilience of a system to deepfake injection attacks has not yet been solved. There are partial solutions. And the best that there are to look at the business system that underlies the service. So to look at mechanisms, processes, and compliance with processes that an organization has to deal with and respond to changing injection attacks. It's very much like a cybersecurity audit system, and actually one such process does exist. In Europe, there is a regulation called EIDAS, the European Identity Assurance Scheme, something like this, which has a whole legal structure behind it, and behind that legal structure is a whole architecture of auditors. So these auditors now come into organizations such as ourselves, and they business systems that provide resilience to digital injection, and IPRU has been certified to the highest level, known as level of assurance, oddly enough, level of assurance high, for the issue of what are known as qualified electronic signatures. That is clearly it's a necessary but not not a sufficient condition for providing good information to the market about injection attacks, but today it's the best that there is. And all that's otherwise left is customer diligence, the reference customers. And that is a challenge because not all major organizations have the resources or the commitment to carrying out real evaluations. Everybody goes through a performative evaluation. I cannot begin to describe to you how when major organizations decided that they were going to assess an increasingly critical part of their identity verification by asking an intern to try and spoof it using a color printer and some masks that they bought in Czechoslovakia for over the course of 2 weeks. I mean, really, an inadequate appreciation of the risks and the threats and the intensity of the attacks that they were seeing, putting an intern and 2 weeks' effort up against threat groups with 1,000 actors. But on the other hand, many organizations do. One of our customers is UBS. UBS spent 12 months reviewing the security of the system to determine whether its systems, processes, and performance were adequate to the task. When we first started working with the US Department of Homeland Security, they put a federal intelligence contractor onto us 3 months to specifically focusing on our deepfake resilience. And when the Singapore government realized that we were, for whom we secure, and in fact secure the authentication, the usage authentication of SingPass, the National Digital Identity System, realized that we were an embedded part of their critical national infrastructure, they commissioned an Israeli military cybersecurity penetration organization to spend 12 months seeking to penetrate and compromise the deepfake resilience of our systems. That's what I call commitment, real rather than performative evaluations, and it costs them a fortune. In fact, it may very well cost them more to do the evaluation than it costs them to buy our services. These are critical issues, and they're going to remain critical issues as the need for strong defenses against deepfakes as part of penetrating the trust architecture of your organization becomes critical. And as CISO, you are asking, and you can't tell the difference between the people who defend against deepfakes and the people who found it's much cheaper to claim that they defend against deepfakes rather than going to the trouble of doing so. We've been doing this now for about 12 years. I came from the world of mobile payments, and I set iProve up because there was a major hack which ended up with millions of people having money stolen from them. And so one of our informal corporate missions is, I don't want to be put back on television again and be asked whether I was complicit or just recklessly incompetent. We're based in the UK. All of our software development, our whole software supply chain is monitored, and we do almost all of our development in the UK using UK or EU-based staff. We're an intellectual property rich company. We're very focused. I mean, this is what we do. We don't dabble in other parts of the IDV segment. And sometimes I say to other organizations that look at other solutions, we have 200 people dealing with the problem of biometric genuine presence, biometric liveness, and I don't do that because I enjoy paying payroll. I do that because this is one of the biggest and most critical issues in cybersecurity today. It's very tricky to solve, but we do so as evidenced by the number of both commercial and security certifications that we've won. I hope I've left enough time for you to ask questions. I'll be around for these days also to speak informally, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you might have this morning. Thank you very much.
We have a mic for you.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, has any organization like utilized this in HR, like hiring processes, or how would you scale that to like a large organization using your services?
How many people are using this for HR now? Very few, is the answer. This is starting to be, the first place this is starting to be used actually is in conducting right-to-work checks in the United Kingdom, where employers can get themselves into very, very serious trouble if they recruit people who don't have a right to work. They can end up with colossal fines and worse. And therefore, the necessity to check that recruits do actually have those credentials becomes essential. It's being used there. We are talking to, don't you hate it when companies say, we're talking to? We are talking to quite a number of organizations about this. We are now of a major project that the City of London Corporation in London is doing to try to defend the financial services sector of the City of London against this kind of attack, and that will be done by that's a program for the second half of this year. But today, in an advanced sales process with any organization who is using this to defend their HR process against the sorts of attacks that KnowBe4 undertook, no. Remember that first photo I showed of the tsunami? HR departments generally are still making sandcastles.
Thank you.
Has your technology been used to detect any of those North Korean threat actors that are trying to deepfake their way into organizations? There's a little bit of a piggyback on the previous question. And then as a follow-up, do you partner with any threat research organizations?
So in most cases, we have no idea. No, we have strong evidence as to where the threat actors are. So I'm always cautious about saying who are the threat actors, because unless they make mistakes, they are quite good at concealing where they came from. We had one major campaign of attack against a bank, which was clearly coming from California, until their VPN slipped, and suddenly there were 2 attacks from an Uzbekistani IP number. Oh, and then it went back to being California again. So we are skeptical. There are some weak metadata signals that give us a sense for which part of the world they come from. Usually it's China, sometimes Russia. But I'm skeptical that we have a good visibility as to where they're coming from, based on the metadata that we receive. Have we been used against those sorts of attacks? Now, I shouldn't amend what I say. We partner with a lot of organizations. So today, for example, there's an IDV organization called Jumio, and we power we provide the liveness for the Jumio IDV process. Is Jumio being used to defend, being used by HR departments? Quite possibly, we wouldn't know. In many cases, we work closely with our partners in particular segments, but in many areas, they are serving such a wide horizontal range of sectors that we actually wouldn't know if that's the case. So the answer is we absolutely partner. Partnership is fundamental because when you do one thing, we produce a high precision, high performance cog in a much more complex machine. Ours happens to be probably where the greatest stress is applied, but we need all the rest of the machine in order to deliver a service. And we partner to do that. It's quite possible that we're being used, but I wouldn't claim to do that yet. I wouldn't claim to know that.
So if I understood your technology correctly, it relies on the one-wayness of your trapdoor in a way that it's easier for you guys to verify whether the reflection is sound or not. You can do it very quickly. You don't need to ask your customer to wait like 30 seconds, but it's hard for the attacker to fake it like real time. So has there been any research published in that? Do you know, is any researcher doing study on that to prove such one-wayness?
Your point is correct, and I will just go back so that because I skipped over it very quickly. This is not a sales pitch, at least not overtly. Let me just see if there we go. So the color code is sent to the device now, so it's unpredictable. The illumination, it takes place instantly. And the signal is not cached. It's sent straight back to our servers instantly. So you're right. There is absolutely a time factor in this. The code space is very large, so the effort required to produce a complete library is very, very big. The attackers are constantly doing real-time attacks. So one of the most popular ways of doing this is that they extract the flash signal, they illuminate their own faces, and then they do a face swap. The problem they have is that they have no information about our classifiers. We have 20 or 30 separate tests looking at all of the signals, and those are invisible to us, and we guard those very carefully. Even if they were to be compromised, they're changing all the time. So our classifier set today is not the same as our classifier set tomorrow. We're looking for very subtle signals. We've been doing this now for 12 years. I first took thrust iPod touches. Anyone remember an iPod touch? Flashing lights in people's faces at Mobile Congress in 2013. So we have 10 years of data ahead of them. So they can forge, and they do seek to forge in real time the imagery. Part of it is the timing, but part of it is they don't really know what a perfect image looks like. The signal, great probably know about convolutional neural networks is they look at very, very, very deep structure in the fabric of reality. And unless you have a very large amount of data, it's very difficult to forge things that are protected by an analysis of that deep structure. So it's partly a question, but it's partly a question of data. Every time they attack us, we learn more about them than about us. So for example, we do not issue scores. Our customers get a pass-fail, and they don't get any kind of a score, because otherwise that would immediately open us up to a hill climbing attack.
Yeah, thank you. So how much of the security relies on the secrecy of your test set?
How much of it relies on the secrecy of our classifiers? I mean, our classifiers are confidential. They are clearly secret, but they're also moving. So so if somebody was able to compromise our classifiers, and we became aware of that, we would change them very quickly so that what the attackers were able to go after yesterday would not be the same as what we're going after tomorrow. So our security relies upon data, yes, but it also relies upon our continuing mobility, upon us being a moving target and not a static target.
What's the delivery mechanism for the identifiers, and does anything remain static on the end user's device?
So the way that it works in a little bit more detail is that we provide an SDK because we have to obviously control the user experience, and that SDK can be a JavaScript SDK. It doesn't have to be a native SDK. That SDK is called from our customer's native app, web or identifier. But we have a backhaul between our customer servers and our servers. So we get partial. So they request a token from us. That token is then used by the app to request service from us, and that is an anonymous token, a pseudonymous token. It is decoupled from the true identity of the user by our customer. So it's mapped in a way that it obscures the true identity of the user from us. We do not want to know who the real identity is, but it is an identifier associated with that image. That is then used to conduct the transaction. We provide an answer back through the host associated with that identifier. That is then passed back to our customer, who then issues a back-end validation call to ensure that the response that they've received is correct and contains information which is never exposed to the device and to the attacker. So a purely device-based attack is not possible. There has to be a compromise in terms of an identity or token stealing attack. There has to be a back-end compromise, which is of course much harder to do because of the trust relationship set up between us and the back-end host. But the identifiers in our system, there is a token-based identifier, and there is a username which is associated with the trusted image. Now we can either get that trusted image in real time from the customer, who snips out the image from the photo ID and passes it to us at the beginning of the transaction. That's fine for remote verification. Or we can store the biometric template either in our systems or on the user's device. And then there is a persistent pseudonym associated with that identifier. But again, that identifier is a piece of meaningless garbage. It's merely persistent associated with the ID. We make it our business to know nothing at all about the identity of the user. So that even if our systems were compromised, and people say, what happens if you broke in and got some of the biometric templates, assuming we're storing them? The answer is, what they'd end up with is a load of encrypted versions of faces, which frankly were on LinkedIn anyway, completely unconnected to any identifiers that would link them to the real world. Does that answer your question? To follow it up, because if you'd like to ask a follow-up, that's an important.
How long does the token remain persistent?
It remains persistent for as long as the customer says. So if it's purely an onboarding, so that the token, so there are two aspects. One is, I think the token has a fairly short lifetime. I'm afraid I don't know, but there's no virtue in that token having any significant lifetime. The token lifetime is there just for the duration of the transaction. That can be a few seconds or a few minutes. That's up to the customer how long we expire it. The username can be destroyed as soon as the remote verification has been completed, or it can be persistent if the customer wants us to subsequently authenticate that user when they come back again.
Have you seen any interest in either enterprise or government in additional biometric factors, like combining iris scans or fingerprint or anything that's not face?
That's actually a very interesting question. You've got to distinguish, in the role of biometrics, you've got to distinguish between the role of biometrics as an identifier and as an authenticator. That's really important. So things like irises and fingerprints, for example, are actually great identifiers because they're so spectacularly unique. You know, work has been done which shows that if you see an iris, you can discriminate hundreds of millions of people that way. Face is pretty good, but you can probably discriminate down to a few hundred, down to 1 million people, something like that. When you start to get to tens of millions of people in a library, you start to potentially get equivocation in identification of people. So, and fingerprints obviously have been used for decades for identification. So if you're trying to figure out who this person is, then irises and fingerprints are pretty good. But if you're trying to determine whether they are whom they claim to be, in other words, authentication, then actually they're a bit rubbish. Because fingerprints, for example, can very readily be spoofed by means of thin silicone covers. And I think with the day that Apple Touch ID came out, a German organization called Chaos Computer Club comprehensively spoofed it. Iris is also, the day that Samsung issued one of their devices with iris recognition, they were immediately spoofed by a photograph with a contact lens over the top of it. So they manage to be rather bad authenticators. Not only are they easily spoofable, which is, as I said, the absolute core for the security of a biometric authenticator, but they're also very inconvenient. The process of authenticating fingerprints, if you're not using an on-device fingerprint reader, which is a so-called contactless fingerprints, it can be done, and we have probably one of the world's leading implementations of it, but it's a bit awkward, particularly if you'd have to engage in what I call thumb yoga. A lot of national states insist that not only do you review 4 fingers, but you look at the 5th finger, the thumb, in case you kind of got to do this, which is very awkward. Whereas with faces, you just look at your face, you just look at the device and it looks back at you and it's very usable. So the face happens to be a particularly good authentication mechanism because it's dead easy to use and it's got probably the strongest anti-spoofing capability. It's very complex, it's illuminated by lots of spaces. There are things you can do, there's a lot of 3D information in there, so it's really great from an authentication point of view. However, we have had demand from a number of organizations for 2-factor authentication without using a device. If you've had your device lost, or you aren't able to rely on a device, as I indicated earlier, but you want strong security, you need 2 independent factors. And what we've majored on is actually palms. Palms are very good biometrics for authentication. They're not quite as good as some of these others that you mentioned for identification, but if a person has enrolled their palm, then all they have to do is to hold their hand up in front of the camera. We can use the same flashing technology that we're using for faces for anti-spoofing, and palms and faces are completely orthogonal. Capture of the face doesn't give you any information about the palm and vice versa. Faces are publicly available, palms tend not to be. So we've had increasing interest in the use of 2-factor palm and face for multi-factor authentication. There are some legal challenges in Europe. There are legal definitions of 2-factor authentication where they insist that that you're allowed one of inherence, but then one of the other has to be ownership, device, or knowledge, passwords. Some organizations are kind of going, that's just nonsense. You're preventing us from using a strong authentication mechanism and forcing us to use something that's a bit rubbish. So we have certainly one major POC now going, combining faces and palms for authentication. For identification, frankly, the easiest way for people to identify is to type in their email address, or to present a QR code, or to do just something which transmits identity information. There's no security, there's very little security in the assertion of identity, so it's all about it being univocal and it being convenient. Using your iris as an identification mechanism, frankly, strikes me as being a bit of overkill. Does that answer your question?
I think we're about at time, so we're going to do one final question, and then Andrew, maybe you can stick around if there's a couple lingering questions.
I'd be delighted to do so.
Thanks very much for your time. Regarding the various forms of biometric data that you're using for authentication, how often do you have to refresh that to be relevant?
Facial biometrics that's a very good question. Facial biometrics are actually surprisingly resilient to time. We have, for example, shown that the score is almost unaffected by a 30-year age gap. So we have reference images for somebody aged 50 who we were then able to test aged 89. So as people get older, the key elements of deep learning-based biometrics don't change. The thing that's hard is adolescence, is puberty and adolescence. So one of the first projects we had was to do KYC updates on people who had as children opened bank accounts, and therefore all the KYC information related to their parents, because as minors they couldn't do that. They get to be 20 years old, and the bank suddenly realizes they've got 1.5 million people who are adults and for whom they don't have any KYC data. But their reference images were all of 15-year-olds. And what we found was that that was in 2018, the KYC, the imagery differences between a 15-year-old and a 21-year-old were really quite marked. Well, that was 2018. By now, I'm afraid the technology has become so good that these challenges are largely going away. So the issues that traditionally were associated with face matching, which I will remind you, I rather dismissed as being the least important, interesting, or challenging of all of the challenges that we have to face. The use of deep learning, of a high data set, deep learning-based face matching has more or less eliminated them. So the age challenge that you referred to, gone. The ethnicity challenge, about which the press had such fun and came out of some 2019 NIST studies, gone. Gender, also addressed, gone. We were fortunate, the biggest ones actually were wealth, because front-facing cameras on $20 Android phones of the sort that the people in the townships of South Africa, who are amongst our users, the imagery there is significantly different from what you get from an iPhone 16 latest edition. Fortunately, we've been doing this long enough that our reference implementation was on a Galaxy S3. Remember the Galaxy S3? So our baseline was on a rubbish front camera with an extremely dim screen. And that meant that, discrimination on the basis of wealth has also been relatively. But what's really important, and I want to emphasize this, we go looking for signs of those sorts of problems. We go looking for signs of reduced performance, for performance issues which can be correlated with one of those factors: device type, age, ethnicity, gender, so on. We measure the performance of our system actively to look for any defects in the product, and if we find them, then we address them. And it's for that reason that we are very confident about the non-discrimination performance of our system, because we look for it. And it's not just a political, it's a product defect. If you find that one group of your users gets rubbish service, that means your product isn't up to scratch and you'd better make it better again. And since product performance is a very important aspect of what we do, we measure our product performance again. In many areas of biometrics, this is a dirty little secret, it's considered that maybe 85% success rate is acceptable. We kind of go, no, anything below 95% and you lose and you just haven't delivered an adequate service. So today we're seeing about 98.5% success rate for good people. The other key metric to look for is the number of attempts to succeed. Because if you can manage a 95% success rate, but you torture your customer with 2 or 3, on average, 2 or 3 attempts to succeed, you've got there, but you've tortured your user. So we consider that anything above an average of 1.2 attempts to succeed is unacceptable. Today we're running about 1.08, something like that. But you've got to measure, if you monitor, if you deliver a service, you can actually monitor and measure these things and identify the circumstances under which they're not being delivered, and thereby assure a quality level of service at an adequate level of inclusion for everybody. I think we're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. I'll be around today and tomorrow, and I'd be happy to answer questions after this show. Thank you.